Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. If you are struggling with how to include textual evidence in your essays, whether it's a research paper, rhetorical analysis essay, or literary analysis essay, I have a solution for you. This is called the I.C.E. method, and it will help you successfully integrate evidence while not impeding the flow or voice of your paper. The first part of an I.C.E. quote stands for introduce. So basically what you need to remember is that you should never just start a sentence with quotation marks because it's very jarring to your reader. So if you end a sentence and then you start the next sentence with a quote, it's almost like you've just been driving along and then you slammed on your brakes. And a lot of students have trouble understanding this at first. So when I tell students to introduce their quote or to embed it into a sentence, they're kind of like, what does that actually mean? So there's a couple ways you can do this. One way is to put a colon at the end of the preceding sentence. Now, this is not a quick fix or a catch-all, but in certain instances, particularly when you're leading into a very long quote, a colon can work. However, a more appropriate solution for most cases would be something like an introductory phrase. Things like, for example, he states or he asserts, or things like in stanza 4 or in paragraph 5 or something like that. Something like the author commences with, and then you can give a quote. Or you could say something like, by repeating the word, and then whatever word is being repeated, you can include evidence that way. So basically, you need to remember that quotes need to be led into. You can't just start a sentence with quotation marks because it really doesn't work. Because remember, quotes are not your own voice. So the idea here is to integrate evidence into a sentence that helps preserve your voice because it's your argument that the person is reading. The C in the acronym I.C.E. stands for cite. So this means like citation. If you're doing an essay in MLA format, you need what we call parenthetical citations. So parenthetical is basically a parentheses, and you put them at the end of a sentence. So for instance, if you're citing a novel, in MLA format, the first time you cite the novel, you put the author's last name and page number inside parentheses, and that goes at the end of the sentence. And the period goes outside the parenthesis. Now, there's different ways to format it for things like poetry and so forth, but basically you need to give credit to where you found the information. Now, sometimes in timed writings, there are less specific requirements. So for instance, sometimes kids use an introductory phrase, like I said previously, in order to indicate where they're citing from. So in line 4 or in paragraph 6, that technically counts as a citation, but you want to make sure that you don't overuse that style either. But basically, it's important to remember that you have to cite your source. So you have to tell where it came from in order to give credit and so forth. So the cite portion is really just that's where you put your quote, and then you just have to give credit to it. So make sure that you are including evidence, but also citing where that evidence came from. The E in the word I.C.E. stands for explain. So this can actually mean analysis or commentary. Those are other words that basically get you to the same point. And that is that you need to actually explain the significance of your quote. So a lot of students think that they've included a quote, so they don't really need to talk about it because it should be really obvious to the reader why that evidence is in there. However, that's not the case. This is actually the wrong way to think about it. So what you need to realize is that evidence is supposed to support your argument. It's supposed to be supplemental. It's not supposed to be the core of your argument. It's supposed to be extra references that are additional, but your voice is the core of it. Your voice is the anchor, not your evidence. And so you don't want to use too much evidence because then you're not doing enough analysis. So basically, just like you need to lead into a quote, you also need to exit out of a quote. And that's where the explain comes in. So as far as what you're explaining, it depends on your prompt, but it's big picture ideas. Things like if it's a rhetorical analysis essay, you're probably going to need to talk about the author's purpose. Why did he or she do what he or she is doing? Why did they make those choices? If it's a literary analysis piece, if it's a novel or a poem, you might be talking about theme or tone and how that contributes to the work as a whole. You also might be talking about things like plot development and character development. So basically, the explain portion is commentary. It's explaining the significance in relation to the passage. Now, one thing that I tell my students is that in a perfect world, you would have more explanation than evidence itself. So more commentary than quotes. And the reason why is because the commentary is your interpretation and it's your voice. And that's what a reader or a scorer is looking for in your essay. So you would want to have maybe one piece of evidence and then 2 or 3 pieces of commentary. So not a 1-to-1 ratio, but a 1-to-2 or 1-to-3 ratio. This would mean that you would be having more of your voice present. And so this is the hardest part for students because sometimes the analysis is what people struggle with. So just keep in mind that after you place a quote in the paragraph or in the essay that you're writing, you need to then explain its significance. You can't just leave it in there and stop, because just like not introducing a quote is kind of like slamming on the brakes. If you have a quote in there and then you don't explain it, it feels like things just ended. So you need to lead into it and then exit out of a quote. It's kind of like sandwiching it and so forth, but this really does help the flow of your paper. Let's look at what an I.C.E. quote looks like in practice. So this is from an essay that a student wrote about Margaret Thatcher's eulogy for Ronald Reagan. Now, she starts with by referring to him as Ronnie. So we have an introduction. We have by referring to him as, that's our I. And then for C, it says Ronnie, so she's put it in quotes. Now, the idea here is that we're using one word. So the student didn't put the line number, and this was a rough draft. So in my classroom, under these circumstances, it's okay. But if your teacher always wants you to cite things, you need to be very careful with that. If this was a more formal paper, I would have encouraged the student to cite it. But because it's just one word, I wasn't really worried about that in this instance. However, what you can see as far as what the student does well is the student then exits with explanation. So we see the use of the nickname shows. Now, shows is kind of simple word choice, but words like illustrates, highlights, reveals, signifies, those all tell your reader that you're about to analyze something. You're telling why the writer made that choice. And so we have more evidence here more commentary here than we do evidence. So the student has a good ratio. They've embedded their quote. And so we hear the student's voice here, not Margaret Thatcher's voice. And I think that's really important when writing an essay. So this is one example of an I.C.E. quote. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope this was helpful if you're trying to figure out how to successfully integrate evidence into your essays. The I.C.E. quote method is one way to do it. So if you're looking for further resources about writing, I do have other videos on my channel that I hope you'll check out. But until next time, guys, happy writing.